Hello, everyone. It's good to be able to connect with you all this way. Since we're not going to be able to have our normal Bible class Sunday morning now for 2 Sundays in a row, I wanted to at least reach out and offer some thoughts on the material we've been studying from Heath Rogers, the Add to Your Faith. And so if you've hopefully been keeping up with this material, you know that we're kind of around lesson 6, lesson 7. And I'd like to just offer some thoughts to help you in your own study with that, and so we can stay up to speed, and by the time we're able to come back together at the building for our normal Bible classes, we'll still be caught up with the material. If you've been in our class, you know we've been studying this passage from 2 Peter chapter 1, the first few verses. Beginning in verse 3 is where we started this quarter, where it says, "His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with steadfastness, and steadfastness with godliness, and godliness with brotherly affection, and brotherly affection with love." That ends there in verse 7. It keeps going on, and we'll study some more of those verses. But right now we're kind of going through this first section of the passage where we started looking at the why. Why are we wanting to grow in our faith? And it's that idea that we get to be partakers of the divine nature. We can be God's children. We can live for him and shine brightly to his glory and his greatness. And so the way we do that, or the how we become partakers of the divine nature, is through our attitude of diligence, that we're making every effort and we're diligent to add these traits that we talk about. And so then Peter goes into this list of things that we're adding to our faith. We looked at the idea of virtue. I appreciate Randy covering the first 2 lessons of this list, where we started with virtue, the idea that we're striving to be genuine people, that this is a real thing that we're doing, no matter what the cost or circumstances might be, that this is something that's real to us, and so we're putting all of our effort into it. And then last week we looked at the idea of knowledge, that we're growing in an understanding of God's will, and that he's given us his revealed word, that we can gain that knowledge, not just from reading his word, but applying it and meditating on it and living by it. And so that brings us to our next trait, or the other Christian grace that we're adding to our knowledge, which here in verse 5 and into verse 6, we add to knowledge self-control. And so I just want to spend a few minutes with you now talking a little bit about this idea of self-control. Your translation might say temperance, self-mastery, or self-restraint. And so this idea is that we are fully in control of our own person, that we're in control of our thoughts and our actions, and that we're very intentional about what we're doing with those things. And as Peter goes through this, he's very intentional as well about the order in which he does this list. And so we're adding to our faith virtue, we're adding to our virtue knowledge, and now we're adding to that knowledge self-control. So it's one thing to know God's will and have an understanding to be able to answer a multiple choice test or fill in the blank of what a certain book, chapter, or verse might say in the Bible. It's another thing entirely to be able to apply those things and actually live by the principles that we find in the scriptures. And so we have a knowledge and we need to be growing in that knowledge, but then we have to take the next step of being able to make this a consistent and deliberate choice of God's will. And so you see here that we must be able to apply it and deliberately choose God's will after we know God's will. I was thinking about this a little bit as I was studying for this video, but we're people typically who more or less like to have a lot of control, and a lot of the things that we invest in and buy give us a sense of control. You know, security systems and insurance and any number of things that we spend money on in this life is about having a sense of control. And as much as those things can be valuable and help with that, a lot of it just kind of underscores the point that we're not in control. But there is actually one thing we actually do have control of in our life, and that's me. I can control myself, how I react to situations, even if I can't control the situations themselves. I can control how I react to those things. I can control what I spend my time on, whether it's in thought or in action. And so in a life that's full of things that we cannot control, God actually gives us something that we can control, and that's our own selves and our own spirits. And so when we think about all the different things we cannot control, exercising self-control isn't just possible compared to all the things that we can't control, but it's actually required if we're going to be a child of God. If you remember, and Heath brings this up in the material, but in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24, Jesus will say, if anybody would come after me, he needs to deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And so we see there one of the key principles of understanding what it means to follow Jesus, to go after him, to be his disciple, starts with self-denial, which is another way that we could phrase this idea of self-control. Because at the end of the day, I'm not in control, and God gives me free will, and I can choose to do whatever I can to try to control things in my own life. But ultimately, I'm made to give him that control back. And so we have this idea that I'm not supposed to be in control, or rather that I need to be yielding my control to God's will. And that means I'm going to align my will, the things I want to do, the things I choose to act on, the things that I pursue, in accordance with what God has revealed is good and right and worthwhile. And so that's that aligning process that if we think of self-control as taking what I think over here and what God has said is true and good and right over here, that self-control is about bringing myself in alignment and bringing myself into harmony with God's ways and his will. The fascinating thing about this is that the scriptures say that it acknowledges that it's a thing we need to be working at, which implies that it takes work and effort, to that diligence point that we've studied already. But the idea is also present in the scriptures that we can learn and actually improve in this quality because we are trained in self-control. If you turn in your Bibles to Titus chapter 2, Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14, this is a passage that Heath in his material in this lesson on self-control will bring up, but I want to spend a little extra time just drawing your attention to the way that Titus is written here, the Paul writing to Titus, beginning in chapter 2 and verse 11. It says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works." We have this idea here that something's training us, it says in verse 12, that we're trained to renounce ungodliness, that we're trained to renounce worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. So the fascinating thing is if you look at this, what or who or how are we trained in self-control to live this kind of life where we do have this restraint and mastery over our emotions, our thoughts, our actions. And it says here in verse 11 that it's actually the grace of God. Certainly God is the master teacher, and he does instruct us in all these different graces and characteristics that we're looking at in this lesson, in this study. But here in particular in Titus 2, 11 and 12, it says that we are trained by God's grace. So when we spend time thinking about God's grace, it should awaken in us this desire to relinquish our control, to not try to control my life and do what I think is best. But when I think about God's pure favor toward me, regardless of anything that I've done, that I've not earned it, but that he lavishes it on me. And when I think about God's love and mercy and all the things that he does to give me a fulfilling and meaningful life, not just for my life here on this earth, but for an eternity with him, that should stir up in me something that says, okay, I want to hold on to this control of doing things how I think, or my gut reactions, or my inclinations. But God's grace is training me to trust him instead. And so I'm going to give him that control. I'm going to seek to control myself that aligns my will rather now with God's instead of my own. So God's grace awakens in us this desire to submit our control. One of the interesting things that I noticed as we were studying here, and I haven't done the full thorough investigation, but it seems when we look at this list, it's very similar, or at least has the same cadence and feel to the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. But actually, self-control is the only word that gets repeated in this list. You could say that faith, the foundational piece, is talked about as faithfulness in the fruit of the Spirit. But here, the idea of self-control is echoed in both of these lists. The idea that's what we're adding to our faith, but it's also that fruit of the Spirit. It's part of the evidence of God's presence in my life. And so this idea that God's grace is training me, that as I'm living by that grace and enjoying that grace and pursuing that grace, that I am wanting to control myself. I am wanting to lay down my rights or the things that I could do or that the world around me might be doing. And I'm choosing instead to live by God's standards and God's rules. And having that self-control is that evidence, that fruit that God's Spirit is at work in me. And it's also the thing that we're trying to add to our faith here, as we've been talking about. Self-control is more than simply just saying no to things, though. And I think Heath mentions this in the material, but there's a lot of stress, and I think we all fall into this, where we think of self-control, and it's like, okay, I got to tell myself no, tell myself no, tell myself no. Titus chapter 2, I think, actually shows us both sides of the coin. Yes, we're to renounce ungodliness. We're to renounce the worldly passions that are in us, but there's also this other side of that. We're pursuing something. We're waiting for this great hope. And that's the thing that's motivating us. We have this idea of we are to be dedicating, that we're zealous to be God's people, to be His possession, and that we're zealous to do good works. So it's not just I'm saying no to things, though that's certainly part of it. Self-control is turning from evil. But it's also the idea that I'm pursuing righteousness, saying yes to those things that God has said is truly worthwhile and valuable for me. I want to look at one more passage with you before we close this study on self-control, and that's Paul's record of his attitude of self-control over in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, Paul talks here about the idea that he is striving in the things that he's doing as an apostle to bring the gospel to as many as he can, that he's become all things to all people, as he's talked about in the passage right before this. And so he wants as many people as possible to share in the blessings of the gospel. And then he enters into this conversation, this image or illustration he uses at the end of chapter 9, 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27, where he uses the idea of an athlete to talk about the self-control he has as he's pursuing this goal of the gospel. He writes here, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others I myself should be disqualified." Not even Paul, this superhero of faith that we'll sometimes think of him as, says, okay, I can rest on my laurels, or I'm kind of a big deal to the point where I don't need to worry about this. He says, I'm going to be very diligent in my adding self-control to my faith. As he says here at the close of that verse, lest after preaching to others, I should be disqualified, that I'm not actually practicing what I preach. And so it's something that every single one of us is striving to work on. Paul's attitude here, if you can notice, is about the idea that he is showing us by his example, but we're all striving to keep our eyes on the prize. He talks about the athlete, the one who's striving to do the absolute best that they can. And while it's not this sort of zero-sum game where if I win, it means that you necessarily lose, but I'm striving to be better in comparison to myself, that I'm always seeking to run this race and understanding that I'm running for this imperishable wreath. He says The athletes that they'll talk about in the first century, they're running for this wreath that's really nice and it comes with some great prestige, but it's going to fade. And somebody's going to come along next year in the games and they're going to have to compete again. And it's always something new and it never satisfies. But this, he says, this imperishable wreath, this is the victory crown of being at the end of a life well lived and having the understanding that what I do now, presently in this life, has an impact on my eternal destination. So that's why I need to bring all these things under control, like Paul is talking about here. And I love the way that he phrases it here, because he's talking about it from that perspective of seeing the bigger picture, understanding that there is eternity to think about. There's a study that's pretty famous where some researchers put young children in a room with a marshmallow, and they say, okay, you can sit here and you're allowed to eat this marshmallow if you want, but I'm going to leave for 5 minutes. The adults leave the kids in the room by themselves, and they say, if I come back and you haven't eaten the marshmallow, I'll give you a second marshmallow and you can eat both. And of course they do the recording to see how the kids are processing this, how they distract themselves. Some of them will touch it, and some of them will just smell it. Some of them do go ahead and eat it. But the opportunity there, the understanding that they're willing to go through that, to control themselves and the urge to have this marshmallow because they know that there's something better that they want to enjoy in the future. That's the idea that we are looking at here with Paul. He says he has this goal. He's not doing this as some sort of futile exercise or just, I'm going to be a good person just for the sake of being a good person. This is who he's called to be. He says, I don't run aimlessly. It's not like I'm just running for the sake of running. I'm actually trying to get somewhere. I don't box as one beating the air. I'm not just sitting here sort of hammering at the air thinking, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. It's trying to get better. And that's what this whole study is about. That's what we're studying this for and striving to do, is getting better, and so that we can add to our faith. And this idea of self-control is so important in that it's important, obviously, to know God's will, and we're looking to do that every day. But as we seek to apply it, I want my will, where I see that it doesn't line up to God's will, I need to be the one that changes, to come into alignment. And so that means pursuing what's truly good and righteous, and yes, saying no to those things that would lead me off the course from this goal that I'm striving for. And so I want to leave you with a question. If you're on YouTube or on Facebook, wherever you're watching this video, I encourage you to leave a comment down below as kind of a way of class participation. And since we can't be together in the same place at the same time, I want you to think, what is just one practical step that you can take this week to grow in your self-control, that bringing your will and how you want to do things the way you've been doing things closer into alignment, more closely in harmony with what God has says is good and right and true. So I want you to think about that and share with me and with our brothers and sisters at West Mason one practical step that we could all take this week. And if each one of us comments, there's lots of different ideas that we can get and share with one another, and hopefully we can add to our faith this idea of self-control. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I hope all of you are well. I look forward to being with you and worshiping you again soon. I'll at least be making one more of these videos as we look at the next lesson on perseverance, but hopefully that'll be the last one and we can be together for the rest of the studies. But until then, I hope you all are doing well and take care.